So if everybody's here and we're ready to get started, if everybody notices, we've got a lot of new faces today joining us, which is wonderful. University of Delaware IPA and DENREC have reached out for the community resiliency communities. I'm pretty sure I just butchered that. I'm sorry, Phil. Have reached out to partner with the city of Lewis as we are tackling some sea level rise items. They've been looking for a project to help with. They've got great science backgrounds, planning backgrounds, so they can give us a bunch of assistance as we move along. And we've got a lot of people listening, so I'm just going to give a little history if you guys are okay, because I know the sea level rise subcommittee's kind of heard this. So we thought it would be a good idea to kind of focus on our next section of the sea level rise with this group. And Tom, you're on twice.
I'm going away now.
Okay. So we're working with the group. And they're here to help us as we tackle new development and an ordinance for new development as it pertains to sea level rise. As most of the people know who are attending online, that we the subcommittee has worked on an ordinance that has been through the planning commission and is before mayor and city council as it pertains to critical facilities and redevelopment. So the next step in the sea level rise discussion is how do we address sea level rise and new development. So that's why we've got this group with us. If everybody wants to kind of introduce themselves, maybe that's a good way to go, because I don't know if we've all met each other. It also gives us the 12 people who are listening and attending online a good idea of who everybody is and kind of their area of expertise. I think we were missing like somebody, because I apologize. Trying to get this group together was, and everybody at the same time is a little challenging, but I'm glad we were able to do it. So I'm Janelle. I'm the planner with the city of Lewis. I'm kind of like the one who kind of makes, I'm kind of like I feel like I'm the Oz behind the scenes, like keeping things going, because you guys just give me everything, and I try to turn it into what you guys are talking about. So that's who I am. Brent, do you want to go next? Because I'm just going to go around my little thing.
I work with GMB. We're the engineers for the town, so we kind of facilitate and help out with these processes. I'm a PE and CFM, and I think one signature away from a climate change professional.
Phil?
Yeah, so I'm Philip Barnes. I'm with the University of Delaware Institute for Public Administration. Also a faculty member in the Biden School, and I have expertise in community planning, sea level rise, and climate adaptation.
Sumner?
I'm Sumner Crosby. I'm on the Lewis Planning Commission. I, in former life, have a planning background, geology background, worked for the Environmental Protection Agency for a number of years, and have been very interested in sea level rise and planning for quite a long time.
Tom?
I'm Tom Panetta. I'm a member of the Lewis Planning Commission and chairman of the Sea Level Rise Subcommittee. I do want to make two statements or a statement up front here. Is I know we've had a lot of questions on the two portions of the ordinance of sea level rise, and also some that have come in to us on source water protection. And as Janelle had mentioned, this has been through Planning Commission. And the next step is a public hearing in front of Mayor and City Council. So I would encourage everyone who has comments or concerns on the ordinances, even though we've given it our best shot at listening to both sides of the argument from the citizens and soliciting the input from many technical experts. The there is another round in front of Mayor and City Council for the public to express their concerns about what's been written so far and to provide us with input for the third section, as Janelle had mentioned, that we're up against now, which is new development. Thank you.
And just so everybody knows, that is May 3rd at 6 o'clock is that public hearing date.
And they're both going to be back to back.
Correct. So both the sea level rise and the source water protection excellent recharge area have a public hearing May 3rd at 6. BJ?
Good afternoon, BJ DeCarsi, staff member here at the Institute for Public Administration, associate policy scientist, and I'm assisting Phil on this project.
Kristen?
Hi, Kristen Thornton. I'm an environmental scientist with DENREC's Coastal Program.
Bob?
My name is Bob Heffernan. I'm a citizen of Lewis on the Planning Commission. My background is primarily engineering, instrumentation, and construction.
Jennifer?
One.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Jennifer Holmes. Sorry, we got two Jennifers. So
That's okay. I just didn't want to overstep my bounds there. Hi, I'm Jennifer Holmes, and I am with DENREC, and I am a planner and the Coastal Training Program Coordinator for the Delaware Coastal Programs.
and then Jen.
Yeah, and for sake of this group, I will continue to go by Jen and not Jennifer. So, but I am a relatively new staff member with the Institute for Public Administration at University of Delaware, and I am a certified planner.
Wonderful. So, Mr. Carter, I have seen your comments, your email. I believe most of those items pertain to the draft ordinance. And I think some of those items actually are not relevant to the sea level rise, as some of those comments do pertain to the excellent recharge area. I would definitely suggest May 3rd, bring your comments. And if you want me to send those comments to mayor and council, just send me an email. I will make sure they get to mayor and council. So thank you for your comments. Sorry, I'm just reading the comments that came in the Q&A. So just wanted to address that. So I think, Tom, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think today we wanted to start about discussing ideas for new development and what that should look like as an ordinance as it pertains to sea level rise.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Janelle. I think, the purpose of this meeting is to set the groundwork for the next and hope, the third phase of the sea level rise ordinance, which is strictly focused on new development within the municipal boundaries of the city of Lewis.
So I think a couple of items. Do we want to continue as previous? Is that we're talking about new development that is located within the 1% and the 0.2% flood areas, or do we want to expand it citywide? I think that's a big question. I know we have critical facilities and redevelopment that we recognize floodplain is going to most quickly happen in the 1% and the 0.2% sea level flood areas. So is that an area that we want to continue with, that the new development, if it's within the 100 or the 500-year flood, that we continue to put those qualifications that you'd have to address sea level rise with them?
Well, I would suggest that since that's the basis of what we did for the first two portions of the ordinance, that we continue on that path for the new development with, obviously, once we get public comment and we hear from the mayor and city council, we can go back and evaluate both what we did prior and this current portion. So we're consistent. Bob and Sumner?
Yeah, there was an article in the news journal, at least it was on Delaware Online, and it quoted Danielle Swallow. I see she's on the attendees here. and it referenced Lewis and the challenge that sea level rise presents to Lewis. Among all the other very interesting points that that article made, I think one of the things that really struck me was that I think it was 36% of all the claims have been outside of the 100-year floodplain. And I know we've heard that before in the water workshops. So I think we need to be careful about solely focusing on the 100-year floodplain, particularly as we get into the larger new development scenario. Just want to put that out there.
Okay, the only thing I agree with Sumner. I think maybe we could start with, we're talking about major development. Let's talk about what maybe where or what a major development might be.
So I think that's the second question is, what do we want to classify as new development? Are we talking any vacant lot that has not been built upon? Are we talking about minor subdivisions, major subdivisions, site plans that are new commercial that require site plan approval? What do you want this to focus on? Which is kind of why I started with, I thought the easier of, are we just going to continue to follow what we've already set up as 100-year, 500-year, you have to build to? And then, yeah, great next step, Bob, is what do we want new development to be? Do we want to catch those vacant lots that they're few and far between, but there are some vacant lots in the city that don't have any buildings on them? Do we want to catch them? Do we want this to apply to our minor subdivisions, which is 4 or fewer or 5 or fewer new lots? Or do we want this to only apply to major subdivisions? Or do we want this to include commercial development as well?
So redevelopment was 5,000 square feet or less, is that correct?
Redevelopment was pretty much if you have a building there and you're going to rebuild it, if you met one of those criteria, that you would be, it would fall into that category. We didn't actually put a square footage requirement on it. We put the substantial improvement, substantial damage definitions from FEMA as to redevelopment.
Well, it would seem to me that for individual lots, that would fall underneath the redevelopment, because at least my thoughts were that new developments were major subdivisions where you had the ability to influence stormwater retention, stormwater design, road systems that were going in, infrastructure, and that all, the break point is at major subdivision.
I would suggest a refinement. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you just said, Tom. I think anywhere where there's an opportunity to affect the pattern and have that pattern reflect not only today, but a sense of the future and what sea level rise presents as the future for an area, I think we should be doing everything we can to keep future problems from becoming a problem. So, down the line. So if some of that can be done in a minor subdivision, I think we should be doing what we can. I look at all these experts on the panel on my screen here, and I kind of feel like it'd be nice to see what we thought we could do from the biggest project, from a major subdivision, a big new subdivision type thing, how we think we could rearrange things, how we could specify things to sort of minimize future damages from sea level rise. And as we work that out, see how we can pick from a list of tools or a list of ideas to see how we can fit that into smaller and smaller scales. Generally, I would agree with the idea that if it's a vacant lot, it sort of fits in the redevelopment scheme, but I'm not sure about minor subdivisions yet. I think it would kind of depend on where they are.
Okay, so
I think the interesting thing is that if we follow that thought, we would probably need to go back and revise the redevelopment wording to ensure that we captured that, because redevelopment, we did clearly say it was tied to the substantial damage redevelop or substantial construction of 51%. So we do have what I would say is a loophole in what we've written so far.
Agreed.
Yeah, and again, we can do that. We're adding, I think it's D. If we look at how the ordinance was written, this is the new section, which is regarding redevelopment or new development. So we can, as we go through this, when we find out things that we need to fix in the other sections, especially after we get through a public hearing, we can always go back and change it. This is why we're doing it like this, because we can learn as we go forward. And if we totally forgot something, we can add to it. But it sounds like
maybe it doesn't have to be revised. Maybe it could be under new development, just a breakpoint of single lots or minors fall underneath the other one and going forward.
Yep, we can do that. But it sounds like we definitely want to hit major subdivisions, right? And it sounds like we want to get some ideas from the wonderful new team we have about what kind of ideas, techniques, mechanisms that we can put in place that could help identify how to address sea level rise in a new development. So if we're thinking and just so everybody understands, a major subdivision for the city of Lewis is 5 lots or more, or any number of lots with a new road or an extension of utilities. So if you're creating 2 new lots, but you don't have utilities to it, then that is a major subdivision. So then how do we address impacts of sea level rise? If we have to build, because we have a couple minor subdivisions going in, or major subdivisions, and they're small, or we've got some minor subdivisions. How do we address the road construction? I know, because I'm bringing back all the stuff we had put in the parking lot. Is how do we address, roads? Do we require the houses to be elevated? Do we want to put some of those BMPs that we have in redevelopment into new development, but use some of those larger ones that we identified that were more appropriate for larger scale to help offset some of that, because we've got, how do we get the water back in? I know it's not completely sea level rise, but if we allow for more open space, it's giving that sea level, the water from the sea level rise, to go somewhere and not damage the buildings. What is based on the length of time, like we did for critical facilities, we said you're building to the 80-year sea level rise, and I'm guessing we're still using the intermediate line because that's what I think we are all agreed to as it's updated. But what year do we want to go out to? What makes sense for a new house that we want to build to? So I'm just throwing a bunch of stuff out there to see if anybody has ideas or suggestions, or is this something we want to do a little bit of research on and come back and have some ideas. And again, I don't expect this all to be solved today or the next meeting. That the first 2 took us a year, and I know with the grant we have less than that, but just some of the things that we've looked at. If we require sidewalks, okay, if we require sidewalks and we have sea level rise, do we need to elevate the sidewalks and the roads to make sure they'll still be there, in 50 to 60 years as the sea rises? I think those are things we want to take a look at, and not just protect the house, but the infrastructure as well. Because if the house is going to be there and there's no infrastructure, how do we find that balance? Am I on a good track for you guys?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
Janelle, I think one of the things I would suggest is that we see if any of the plethora of experts that we have here could provide us with some insight into what we've talked about and how we should eventually go forward.
Or before we cut loose on that, I just want to reflect on, I think, some of the more meaningful things that I've heard in various planning commission meetings and other meetings over the last couple of months, and that has to do with the role of groundwater. It's something that we've not really focused on with this excellent recharge stuff that's been going on concurrent with the sea level rise. We've heard from folks from Delaware Geological Survey that I think have shown very clearly that we shouldn't take for granted the role of groundwater rising in concert with sea level rise. It may very well be that there will be areas further inland, further upland that will be affected by groundwater. They don't necessarily fit in the floodplain, but I think we need to keep that in mind too as we're working on these planning solutions.
And I think maybe something else that we can get expert advice is we've recognized that what we like the first thing we talked about was, are we going to continue to follow the floodplain as it relates to sea level rise? Because we've all looked at the inundation maps that that DNREC has provided, so we appreciate that, and it all seems to follow the floodplain. And we also recognize that the floodplain maps for the FEMA floodplain are based on history, but we also expect them to change over time, and we expect them to increase. So we are not tying a date to the floodplain maps. We're just saying, hey, if you're in the 100-year, the 500-year, the 1%, and the 0.2%, and as it changes over time, that you're subject to the sea level rise, because based on the inundation maps, that seemed to be where the sea level was occurring the most, was following really the floodplain. And we know that was, just something where we're looking at. So that's just something to keep in mind. Sorry, I lost my train of thought, which is
Right.
So
Well,
at this point, why don't we ask Phil and the team to chime in with some opening thoughts?
looks like Jen's got something to say.
Okay.
Well, I mean, Phil, if you want to go first, I just had written down a couple of questions, because we're coming in you guys have been at this for a long time, obviously, and are very familiar with your ordinances. And I was just trying to get a better feel of kind of how you got where you are in terms of, and part of it, I'll have to just read more of what your draft says, but I was a little confused of how development on a vacant lot would qualify as redevelopment, like how that would fit, because you're not getting substantial redevelopment. There's no damage happening on the lot. So how do we get to a point where when you develop on there, you're considering that redevelopment, I guess?
I think that's actually one of the issues I think we just stumbled on, that, and if we define under new development it being major only, greater than 5 or infrastructure, we have a hole. So I think that maybe in this section we can cover both individual lots being built on, and maybe it's not the same criteria as a subdivision where you have more land and more access to other types of means of mitigating. So I think that is absolutely one of the items that we, it's a work in progress.
I'd also add that just by happenstance with the way that the BFE works and the 18 inches of freeboard, that kind of new development or new houses are basically meeting what we've proposed in the sea level rise, because your current elevation is around 3, whereas your finished floor needs to be around 9. So people are just presenting parking under the first floor and adding that additional buffer there. So they're meeting the whole intent of the sea level rise. I'm not going to say inadvertently, but the intent is there and we're checking that box. So it kind of works out.
I think you're right, Brett, but it's not by ordinance.
Right.
If someone wanted to.
It's by happenstance.
Right. So that's part of the discussion we had earlier on the fact that raising the ground floor elevation and not raising the roof elevations was not an undue hardship, because houses, as you suggested, are being built with under building parking or other storage and still staying underneath the 34-foot elevation. And the corollary to that was we felt that there's both an individual property rights issue and a general property rights, because while an individual may want to raise their house 3 feet by the sea level ordinance, what about the impact on the neighboring properties?
And then
just another answer to Jen. I think I assume that part of the reason we put the redevelopment and the vacant lot, primary new development, is a matter of scale. That's how I've imagined it, simply because it was a single lot rather than it being multiple lots. But you raise a really important question. I'm glad you asked that.
And then, as we're talking about like vacant lot, minor subdivision, major subdivision, it sounds like the focus is solely on residential when we say that. Is that correct? Or is that something under discussion?
I think
It
there's
should
something
be.
that we need to include, maybe look at the commercial as well, which is why I kind of brought it up. I think we've got, and I think maybe it's like Tom said, is we look large versus small for residential, and then we look at maybe different criteria for commercial, because commercial, you're not typically building roads. But I think we've got major subdivision, vacant lots, minor subdivision, and commercial. And, a 2-lot minor subdivision, 3-lot minor subdivision is completely different than, if I'm building 89 lots. So maybe we need to take a look at, the different criteria for those. And this is why we left this one to the last, because we knew this was going to be a little bit more challenging, because there's a lot of moving pieces when we're talking about new development. So and maybe it's like looking at that break point. If you're like the single lot or minor subdivision, these are your criteria. If you're a major subdivision, these are your criteria, or commercial, these are your different criteria. I'm just throwing that out there. I think it's something we want to discuss and come up with ideas. Anybody else have questions, ideas, things to kind of go, BJ?
I had one question, Janella, but something you said earlier about how the 100-year and 500-year floodplain you thought was a fairly good proxy for the inundation maps. I just want to make sure that I was hearing you correctly, and that people outside of those areas would be regulated kind of once they were subsumed by them. That we're not looking to. Okay.
Yeah, because we've had a lot of discussion, and maybe it's like I'm in the floodplain, so I'm subject to it, but my neighbor is not. And we've had the discussion. It's like maybe we put a buffer and say, okay, how do if you're just beyond. We've had a lot of that discussion trying to figure out what's the most appropriate way, and we figured as the flood maps change over time, and we expect them to probably grow and shrink, that then we'll kind of capture more and more of the lots, and more of the city, to address sea level rise. And that's the discussions we've had.
Maybe if you folks could chime in. We do recognize that the regulations allow us to create special flood zones, but the discussions we had were the cost of developing those and the potential risks involved with it in defending them outweighed doing what Janelle just said, was relying on the 105-year and 500-year. And given the way the inundation maps look, it didn't look like there was that much adjoining area that was not covered at this point in time.
So are you saying that you had considered developing or asking somebody to develop a new flood model for the city that would incorporate flooding and sea level rise, and then use that as a regulatory product?
Yes.
Or we also kicked around just like 1,000-foot buffer or an X amount of buffer outside the 1% chance.
Yeah, because there was a lot of discussion about, you know, just because you're not in the floodplain doesn't mean you're not going to flood, as Danielle Swallow has provided us. And we've heard from Houston and other places is that a lot of the places that are flooding are not actually in the floodplain. And again, we're dealing with sea level rise, but as the sea level rises, then the flooding is going to then impact other properties beyond that. So it's like, what do we do? And how do we protect the houses outside of that? But as of today and the draft ordinance, it's just for the properties that are in the 100-year and the 1% and the 0.2%. But if you guys think maybe there's a good way to like, how do we expand like a buffer to get like, like Sumner and I are next door to each other, but Sumner's in the floodplain and I'm not, so I don't have to build to the sea level rise, but he does. But I'm probably going to get impacted just the same as he is. And that's been a really big part of our discussion is like, based on what we have and the information we have, how do we find that balance and protect as much as we can as we go along.
So,
Particularly at the margins.
One of the reasons why we had debated these 1,000 or whatever foot lateral buffer, but it seemed like without taking into account vertical rise, determining a lateral buffer in an area as flat as we are wasn't, I wouldn't say meaningful, but we didn't know that it was actually going to give us that much protection.
Let me throw a different, I mean, with all the folks that are on here that haven't been a part of this conversation, I mean, Tom just mentioned, there's something to be said for sort of classifying the landscape, particularly the landscape that's most vulnerable according to its elevation. It sort of gets at the coastal inundation maps. It gets at who's most at risk and who's less at risk. The floodplain maps basically have a winners and a losers, a binary choice. But in fact, we have a lot better information than that available to us. I'm curious, among the planners that are here from IPA and other places, do you know of any examples where people have used strict elevation, the feet above NAVD 88, sea level, whatever number you want to pick, as a way of distinguishing the landscape and making requirements of work within those areas? And one of the reasons I bring this up is, and I've been harping on this as long as we've been talking about it, wetlands fit down inside of that floodplain area, but as the sea level rises, the wetlands are going to move. And I want to make sure that we're not going to preclude their migration by building up to the current wetland line plus the small horizontal buffer we have when sea level, just like Tom Panetta said, in a low-lying area, in a low slope environment, every foot of elevation is going to bring the water in a lot further than 50 feet. And I want to make sure we're protecting our wetlands down the line. And in the larger new developments, I think we have more room to sort of move things around and make all the furniture and all the pieces fit, while still allowing the wetlands to move and thrive. But these are just ideas. I hope you all can help us out.
Yeah, so Sumner, I think you just answered one of the questions that Janelle asked earlier, which is what do some of these tools or strategies look like? And particularly in terms of wetland migration, which you point out is important and will happen as long as there's not some hard engineered structure or barrier in the way. A setback. And I believe you do have a wetland subcommittee that has worked on this topic, right? But
The city
increasing your setback from the wetland would be one way to have that.
Yeah, we actually recently adopted late last year a 50-foot buffer from the edge of wetlands. So we do have that. Right now, that only pertains to major subdivisions, but that has been adopted. We haven't had anybody come through that needed to take advantage of that yet, because haven't had a major subdivision with wetlands yet.
And is that within the current city limits? Is this an issue? Do you have major subdivision potential that does border wetlands?
We particularly have the possibility in the areas that we've identified for annexation as the opportunity arises out on the edge of town. For example, up New Road, along the margins of the Great Marsh, the upper reaches of the Canary Creek watershed. And then there are areas, I guess there possibly could be some situation out Savannah Road, perhaps, right there by the well field. I don't know if how that fits in with our annexation and our city line.
So these are areas that currently are not part of the city, but
Could be.
expected annexation areas.
Yeah, we've identified them in our comprehensive plan as being areas that we would be open to annexing into the city.
There are several plots of land that would fit that criteria, though, inside the municipal boundaries.
Yeah.
There are areas that abut wetlands that are not developed now or are subject to redevelopment that would fall in this.
Previously, I think the point was made that we were talking about just what's in the current municipal boundary and development and redevelopment, but with the discussion of annexation, would there be any appetite in the town to say, we won't entertain accepting annexation unless certain requirements are met, perhaps, building as if you were in the 500-year or the 100-year floodplain?
Well, and Janelle, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, once it's annexed into the city, I mean, part of that is they would have to be either grandfathered if there's existing structures, or they would then have to meet the current city ordinances.
Correct. But what I think BJ is getting at is if it's not in the floodplain and it annexes and we say, well, we want you to build the sea level rise. And I think that's what you were talking about, is if it's not in the floodplain and you annex, but we want you to build to the higher standard. And I think that's a tricky question, because we want to encourage annexation into the city. The city feels a lot of pressure from development coming towards the city, and the city wants to have some impact on how those lands develop. So it's, how do we entice people to come into the city and be annexed? A good way is, hey, if you need water and sewer, you kind of need to get into the city, which is, an item. But it's like, how then do we encourage development into the city? And it's a balance that the city has been working on. We've got annexation zones that kind of give you a little bit of extra density, and those are being looked at. It's like, how do we do that? But it's we want you in the city. We want to give you carrots, but we don't want to quite give you sticks, because if there's a stick out there, you're not going to want to annex, but we want you to annex. So it's really finding that balance of development and making it feasible and desirable to want to come into the city of Lewis.
But to build on what you just said, Janelle, and to respond to BJ's question, which I think is an excellent question, something that's been on my mind for quite a while. I think we're headed in the direction. I may be ahead of myself a little bit. We have an annexation. We have a subcommittee of the Planning Commission that's looking at annexation. And I could imagine a scenario where we've got to strike that balance. We've got to find a way of being able to entice and incentivize people doing something in these areas within the city, that they would sign up to be a part of the city. But I'd like to think that there's a way that we can also achieve some of the goals we have here with sea level rise if we're starting with a blank piece of ground. I would like to think there's a way. My feeling is an objective of the annexation should be to strike that balance, to be able to set a better future in terms of where we would rather you not build, and in return, you get these many more allowances to do building elsewhere. So I think that's a really important question that you ask. I hope that we do that, that we say we expect that things will fit our future sense of the city, even though they may not today. Need to be thinking that way.
I think this is a question we need to validate with the city solicitor, but if we had an ordinance on the book that said this covered outside of the 500-year floodplain and a property was going to be annexed in, city council, to my best belief, does not have the ability to waive that. The ordinances are the ordinances. The only thing that they can do is for pre-existing structures, grandfather them. Janelle, is that your understanding?
BJ, did you want to say something?
I probably should let you go first, but
Okay.
I mean, but council does decide whether, there's a motion, we either make a motion to annex this or we don't. So council can always just choose not to annex. I mean, there's no one holding a gun. There's no way to force council to annex.
Yeah, so
absolutely, but if they agree to annex, I don't think they can waive specific parts of the ordinances of the book that are on the books.
No, they cannot. So I'm just going to use something completely not environmental. So if a property annexes into the city and they're not in the floodplain, their maximum height is 30.5 feet. Council cannot waive that. So if a new property is going to be built, a new house is going to be built, it has to be built to 30.5 feet. If it was taller in the county and it annexes, they still have to build to the 30.5 feet in the city because that's our regulations and rules. So yeah, they'd have to comply with whatever we have. The only relief is if it's something waivable in the subdivision and land use code, or if they want to get a variance from the Board of Adjustment. And that's not always, neither of those happen frequently. So I kind of want to bring it back is, so it sounds like we want to follow the floodplain, but we're maybe looking at different criteria based on how big the development's going to be. And that's major subdivision, one lots, minor subdivisions get different criteria, and then maybe commercial gets a different criteria. And we're looking for ideas for how do we address infrastructure? How do we address, what are those criteria? And I think that to me is kind of sounds like what we've been kind of discussing is like we want some of those ideas so we can start moving forward with kind of going forward. And I'm going to give my sea level rise subcommittee, Bob, Sumner, and Tom, some homework. Is I want you to start thinking about, do we want to continue to use the intermediate line, which I'm going to guess is yes, but then what year do we want to project out?
Well, on that last question, Janelle, I'd like to hear from the panel that we have here. We've always talked about what the proper year to use for projecting out. When you're talking about existing houses and redevelopment, and critical infrastructure, we chose dates, but given the fact that housing stock is in general designed for a usable life of 100 years, and we don't want to create communities that 50 years from now, as Janelle pointed out in the beginning, while the structure may be standing, they're inaccessible, or the infrastructure starts to fail. What is going on nationally, industry-wide, for starting with a green field for new construction?
In terms of what?
Well, if we choose the mid-level curve.
Oh, right. So
What year to
it's
project out to for new construction?
I think you're referring to the most current DENREC sea level rise projections, right? With
Yeah,
the three colored lines. And Danielle, who's on the call here, actually had a hand in developing those. And so she's
correct.
actually probably more qualified to speak to this than I am. But those are probabilistic,
Right.
right? So you're expected to pick the line. You're not necessarily, I don't think your first concern should be the year. I think your first concern should be your risk tolerance and the criticality, if that's a word, the criticalness of the item that is being developed. So if it's a stormwater or if it's a wastewater treatment plant, that's something that you don't want to fail, and you want to select the most conservative probabilistic curve there, right? So you would pick the red line, and then after that you would use a design life of the plant itself, for example, right? So if you're designing um, tennis courts, okay, you would pick the low risk scenario, the because that's if it floods, it's you're not out a wastewater treatment plant, for example, right? So first you determine the nature of what it is you're building or developing, and then select a line based on um, the criticalness of that item, and then pick the year. So if we're talking about, right, so if we're talking about commercial, that might have a different risk tolerance than residential, for example. So that's the way that I would first approach it.
So
Phil,
it's interesting because we did was looked at it slightly differently to get to the same outcome. We chose the blue line, the 50-50 line, for all of the prior ordinances, and chose 50 years for redevelopment because that gets you a distance. And then we chose 80 years for critical infrastructure like EOCs, healthcare facilities, wastewater treatment plants. Because of that, and we were addressing risk by that. It kind of got us to the same point you're saying.
Yes.
I understand what your logic is. We probably backed into the same number.
But I'm not sure that we did. Actually, just listening to what Philip just said, my bet is if you go out 80 years on the red curve, it's going to be a more dramatic scenario than going out 80 years on the middle curve, whatever the colors are. You pick the more aggressive curve with the higher probability or the higher risk concern. The numbers are going to get scarier.
Right, and we did actually start with what line do we want to use, and that was also prescribed by council. They said use the intermediate line.
Right, but I think we may all want to reconsider. That Philip raises a really important point. Depending on the facility, depending on the particular application of a sea level rise scenario, we have a lower tolerance for risk, for example, with the sewage treatment plant or a water treatment facility than we do with a house or a parking lot or a tennis court. And that's what those curves were designed for. We haven't really used them that way. We instead said, well, we're comfortable with a 50% probability. We're going to pick that intermediate thing because it's the most comfortable. I think the point that Philip made, though, is something that we all might want to think about. I think there's a reason for us to rethink this a little bit.
Yeah,
I don't think we missed too much though, because we started with the base flood elevation, and for the critical facilities, we started with the 2% elevation, and then added in the freeboard, and then added in that sea level rise projection. So we got there. It just might have been a circuitous route to get it, but
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like if you were doing critical facilities at the mid probability line at 80 years. I mean, I don't have the curves in front of me, right? But it's as Tom and Brett say, that may be equivalent to the red line at 50 years.
Right. I mean, we kind of worked it
That's
out.
about right. And
Ran a
I've got them in front
scenario
of me.
that like a finished floor was going to be around 14 for a critical facility in the 500-year floodplain.
I mean, the other problem we have is that we sort of have the 2016 direction from City Council, which is plan on the middle line. And given the way things are, it's kind of a problem to circle back and change that. I mean, we
Well-
can, it can be a recommendation.
I think if
but
you're-
we'll be back through 2 sets of public hearings and whatever.
I would just say that, well, city council back in 2016 had a sense of the council. I certainly don't feel bound by what our recommendation should be relative to that, because they are the final deciding factor. And if we think that the best judgment is something else, it's behoovent on us to make that recommendation to mayor and city council. So 2016 was a long time ago. I mean, it's 5 years ago.
And
And
don't
they
forget,
did what was best at the time, but you know,
yeah,
we
and
need
don't
to do what's correct now.
Yeah, and don't forget we're using the newest information that every time the projections get updated, that's the information we'll be using. So that's actually been written into the ordinance. So we're not stuck with a certain year. It's whatever it is at whatever's been adopted or proposed at the time, we use that. So I expect that balance. So I think back to our homework, it's like, okay, if we're going to take a look at vacant lots and minor subdivisions, do we want to use a different line than major subdivisions and commercial? Or do we look at all residential gets one line and commercial gets a different line? And then what year do we want to project out to based on our different uses? And then, so I think that so everybody, all the new people, I call it homework. So I'm not the only one working on stuff. So everybody can kind of give their feedback. So we're doing this as a joint effort. And then I think it's, what kind of different criteria, different ideas do we have that are going to address, our infrastructure? Because we can't address, existing buildings, or existing roads, we can't address in the zoning ordinance because that's just not something what the zoning ordinance impacts, but we can address it in the subdivision regs. And this can tie back to that. Because if you're going to build new, we can do that. So we might actually have to tweak not just 197, which is our zoning code, but we might have to tweak 170, which is our subdivision code, to say, okay, if you're impacted by sea level rise, we want the roads to look like this, or the sidewalks to look like this, or we put in a bunch of best management practices because we also recognized, well, just not sea level rise, but we get a lot of stormwater management, especially for those one lots and those minor subdivisions that sometimes it just gets addressed on site. Maybe we want to encourage some of that greener infrastructure that we recognize really doesn't work on one individual lot, but is better for a larger commercial or a major subdivision. And then again, whatever you guys think would be helpful. And if you've got any feedback or any ideas, and like right now, like what's a good course, we're happy to listen.
So
I would ask Phil and the rest of the team, the idea of commercial is a topic that we really haven't spent a lot of time talking about so far. And what's the general view as far as risk tolerance for the commercial properties versus these other ones, residential and critical infrastructure we've talked about? You think that should be more lenient, or?
So I'm going to answer both Janelle's question and Tom's question at the same time, which is, this is something that I can make assumptions on, but I think we also need to do some research. and go and find what's out there. I hate to speak to or make assumptions about the risk tolerance on commercial properties, knowing that there's a great diversity of types of commercial properties, and say, oh, you should use the intermediate line or the high risk line or whatever. And at the same time, to answer Janelle's question, you know, the ideas for how to potentially modify or make your infrastructure more resilient and your development more resilient within major subdivisions. This is something we had the IPA team had done a small amount of research prior to this meeting, looking at what other communities have done, knowing that what you're trying to do is to somehow incorporate sea level rise into new development. But we weren't exactly sure where and to what extent this group was willing to go. I think we have a better sense of that now. So we're not prepared at this point to answer your questions, but it's something that we can certainly. This is why we're here. We can take this and do right. Janelle, give me some homework. Okay, so these are the types of things that we can help with.
Given what you've heard so far, Philip, are there other questions that you would have for us that would better help you be able to put things together, just based on all the comments we've thrown out there?
Yeah, so it to me it sounds like just to confirm what you're looking to do in terms of the spatial extent of your inundation. You're defining this as the 500-year or the 0.2% scenario within the current flood risk adaptation, or I'm sorry, I'm mixing my acronyms. The firms, the flood insurance rate maps. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
And that was another question that we had. We didn't know which, you know, if you were looking to add sea level rise onto the existing floodplains, or if you were going to go with something, because we did see that you're in the current draft of the resiliency ordinance, you had identified the 0.2. So that's what you want to do for the new development as well, which makes sense, at least in terms of consistency. I guess a logistical question. This is, and again, we did look at the draft ordinance. This is part D of that ordinance. Are you waiting for the entirety of this before you put it in front of council, or are you going to take this, what you have done already, which you've worked on, and here we are coming in at this point, are you going to take what you've worked on prior to our involvement and present it to council for adoption, or are you waiting for this to go with it?
And it actually was voted on at the last planning commission meeting and sent to mayor and city council, the first two portions. And then the city council has set a public hearing on it. And to get we had a public hearing at planning commission. Mayor and city council is required to have one also. So in answer to your question is, the first two parts are in front of city council at this point. If it needs to be revised, or they may remand it back to us based upon the comments from the public hearing. We either have the ability to revise it down the line, or we'll get a second bite at the apple.
Yeah, and nothing prohibits us, if we realize something we see in new development, we can always go back and make a recommendation to amend the critical facilities in the redevelopment section. Nothing prohibits that, but this is really the critical facilities in the because the subcommittee has worked really hard. They wanted to keep getting things moving forward. So those have been forward to council, and hopefully within the next couple of months, we'll have some portion of a sea level rise ordinance adopted. If not, we're going to continue to work. And that's why we've kind of broken it up into sections so we can add to it as we go. And that's also the reason it's not called sea level rise, it's called resiliency, because we thought there might also be other things not pertaining to sea level rise, but are resiliency items that could be tackled in this ordinance. And the intent was to allow for this ordinance to be able to grow as new items come available, because there's so many different concepts and ideas that, you know, the subcommittee has had. So we were taking a kind of a broader aspect and, like, you know, working section by section and slowly getting everything hopefully adopted a little bit at a time.
Okay, but that public hearing is again.
May 3rd. May 3rd.
Hello?
Regarding critical facilities and redevelopment. So that's what's on the agenda for May 3rd for the resiliency section of the code.
And just to be clear, and the source water protection ordinance as a totally separate topic.
Yes, completely separate topic.
But it's going to be
Same night.
Yeah.
We have a bunch of things in the question and answer. Do we want to try to address those before we end? Or I'm not really sure what the timing here is, what we're doing.
Oh, I've been
So
trying
I
to
would-
address some of them.
So I will address Mr. Carter's comments. I encourage you to attend the May 3rd meeting with Mayor and City Council and voice your concerns there. And once again, Mayor and City Council have the ability to either address it at their level or to remand it back to Planning Commission for further work.
And I
So-
think Brent also had maybe some comments for that one. Nope. Okay. It just said,
I clicked on it and it got there and I couldn't get out of it,
okay,
unfortunately.
that's okay.
And I didn't want to click done because then it would take it away.
Completely goes away. And then Danielle Swallow has provided a lot of comments and some good information and great insight. You know, that, yep, Phil is right, that risk tolerance and trade-off factor into the selection of the curve. You know, and there are a bunch of different trade-offs from house design for conditions 100 years out. You know, it might be too expensive and too cumbersome. And I think it's, again, us finding that balance. We want to protect it, but we also want to allow for the development. So what is the item going? How do we find that balance?
Just a point on Danielle's various comments. I mean, you know, she's made this point consistently. We all need to embrace the fact that there's going to come a time when parts of our community will no longer be as easy to live in. And we need to come to terms with that. You know, maybe it's not going to happen in the next month or two, but we've heard now from a number of experts about how things are going to change over, you know, sort of the medium to long term. And given the changes that will occur, it's going to take some considerable effort for us to be able to respond to that. We're not going to want to wait until until all those things happen. Anyway.
All right, so are we good on homework? Because I just got notice that somebody's got the Zoom account for 3 o'clock. I'm guessing, oh, now I've been told we don't need to worry. But any other questions? Because I think it sounds like we're starting to wrap up. We've got some good ideas. We've got some homework. Do we want to think about, you know, when do we want to get back together? Or does somebody have any more questions? Because don't let me shut you down. Just, you know.
So two things, Danielle. No, I'm sorry. I think it'd be good if you just write an email to the entire panel on what the expectations are for the next meeting. Just a quick one. And I was trying to keep notes as we were going here, but it's not always. And second, I do agree. I think we should set a next meeting. We want to keep this moving.
And the other thing I would say,
thank you for everybody that's here. I'm really excited that we have the opportunity to work with you.
the other thing I would say, Janelle, is when you get a comment from somebody, how about sending it out to the people, to everybody, so we can say, oh, well, Sumner's got a good idea or whatever, and gets some chance to think about it before we're doing the TV thing.
Yeah, it's just we can't respond back and forth to those
I
items.
understand that.
So, but yeah, I
But
mean, sometimes
You have 4 or 5 experts here. If they can say, how about you think about it this way, that'd be helpful.
we can definitely do that.
There's a question in the Q&A. Somebody's got a hand up.
Okay, let me. Okay, Jim, you just need to unmute yourself.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you everyone for all your hard work. I'm just a little confused on the one piece of the ordinance that expresses the 23 inches above the freeboard, which is 18 inches above the base flood elevation. I do understand the 18 inches above the BFE because it seems like that gives the city a discounted rate through the NFIP, which is fantastic. I just feel like you're double dipping. It doesn't make any sense to me. So the base flood elevation is based on the FEMA firm maps. Your FEMA map is based on the true elevation. Shouldn't it read it, if you're worried about the sea level rise, shouldn't it read a minimum of the 500-year sea level rise, which you express in the ordinance, 23 inches, or the 18-inch freeboard above the BFE? I'm not understanding why the first floor of a structure would have to be 4 feet above an existing road. So if you have an existing road and you're developing on an empty lot, that road has to be 4 feet underwater, that you're still trying to protect that house. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. That just seems unreasonable.
And that is noted. If you want to bring that up on the May 3rd, that is definitely something that council can consider as part of that ordinance. Because
the only thing, and we won't discuss it outside, but the 18-inch freeboard, and Brett, you feel free to chime in, is really an uncertainty factor that's added. The base flood elevations do not take into account sea level rise at all. And so using the base flood elevation like we did and adding the sea level rise gives you the future would be the base flood elevation. And then the 18 inches or the freeboard number is the uncertainty. Is that
right?
Right?
So as the sea level rises, the 1% chance is going to migrate and move, and those elevations are going to change, because if we get a foot of sea level rise, the base flood elevation is no longer going to be 7, it's going to be 8. So then you're eating into the 18 inches of freeboard. If we get the 23 inches of sea level rise and you build the 18 inches, then you're 5 inches underwater on a structure. So it basically builds in that future growth, keeps the freeboard as kind of a buffer in there. And part of the 18-inch thought process is that's kind of an NFIP. I'm not going to call it standard, but that's what's been utilized, because that's what's getting you a better rate on your insurance. So it's kind of a guidance doc instead of actually a hard requirement, but making it a hard requirement raises the flag and raises the awareness for the NFIP and the insurance rates.
And it makes the assumption that your building today is going to be there in 30 or 50 years.
So Jim, if you have more questions, I appreciate that, but I think May 3rd is probably your best bet, because that is really where, because this group has already made their recommendation, commission's already made their recommendation. So the best people to hear any questions and take any comments is mayor and council. You can email me. I believe there's a form that you can submit comments on the website. Please include your name and address. That way I can tie them back to somebody when they ask. And then May 3rd at 6 p.m. The agenda will be posted, and the Zoom link will be on the agenda when it is posted 7 days prior to the meeting. So if there's nothing further, if everybody's good, it is time to plan our next meeting.
Well, it probably should be after May 3rd.
That would probably be a good idea. So if we're looking at May, so we've got the week of the 10th of May. How does that look for everybody?
Isn't that the night of the city council, Janelle?
The week of the 10th? No. Due
Council's
to the
3rd and
election
17th.
is the 17th due to the election.
Okay, I'm sorry, I still had it on. I thought since the election was the 8th, okay.
No, there's a time frame that it has to happen, so it actually gets pushed back an extra week.
Okay.
So we have
I'm just wondering, and I don't have an strong opinion on, since the public hearing is gonna be on the 3rd, city council will probably have a discussion on this at their meeting. I guess, no, there's no reason to delay. And the week of the 10th would be fine.
Okay. Is there a date that works for everybody? How does Monday look?
Monday's not good for me.
Okay. The
Tuesday,
11th.
Wednesday, Thursday would work fine.
I have a meeting at 11 to 12:30 on the 11th. Other than that, it's fine with me.
I have classes on the 11th from 9:30 to 1.
Okay. How about the 12th?
I would be
Okay.
free after 1 on Tuesday, the 11th. The 12th is open for me.
Well, how about 2 o'clock on the 11th then? Does that work for everyone?
Am I getting
Works
some
for me.
nodding heads? All right. Perfect. 2 o'clock on May 11th. All right. And if you guys come up with ideas ahead of time, please email it to me, and then I can email it to the group so we can start thinking as Bob has suggested, so we can keep the discussion moving a little bit faster. And just as a reminder for everybody, and it wasn't you guys, please do not reply all to when we're discussing items, so not to avoid FOIA issues. And if there's nothing else, thank you everybody. And I look
Yep.
forward to continue working with everybody.
And Janelle, I would like to follow up with you, not now after this, but just in terms of how we set up this communication channel to comply with FOIA and all of that. I want to make sure we get that so that we're giving you information and communicating with you in a way that's all FOIA compliant.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you all.
Thanks,
Really
everyone.
appreciate it.
Everybody have a great afternoon.
You too.